In 1942, a British general did something that most military historians now agree saved the entire Allied position in the Middle East. He stopped Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, dead in his tracks at a tiny Egyptian railway halt called El Alamein. He did this with a battered, demoralized army that had just been chased across hundreds of miles of scorching desert. He did it by choosing the right ground, making the right calls under impossible pressure, and sleeping in the sand alongside his men while the fate of the Suez Canal and the Persian oil fields hung in the balance. His name was Claude Auchinleck, and you have almost certainly never heard of him. What nobody knew at the time was that the man who would replace him, Bernard Montgomery, would spend the next 3 decades taking credit for the victory that Auchinleck made possible. Montgomery would become a household name, celebrated as the hero of El Alamein, the general who beat Rommel, the man who turned the tide in North Africa. Auchinleck would be quietly pushed aside, remembered only as the general who was sacked, the cautious commander Churchill lost patience with. And the real story, the one that Rommel himself knew, would be buried for decades. If you had asked anyone in the British Indian Army about Claude Auchinleck at the turn of the 20th century, they would have told you he was one of the finest young officers they had ever seen. They had no idea what was coming. Auchinleck was born in 1884 in Aldershot, England, into a military family with roots in Ulster. His father was a colonel in the Royal Artillery, and young Claude grew up consumed by soldiering. As a boy, he used to drill his brother and 2 sisters in the back garden and then hand out tasks around the house like a miniature commanding officer. By the time he was 12, he had designed and built an entire trench system in the family orchard. The kid was born for this. He went to Wellington College and then to Sandhurst, but his family did not have money. Scholarships carried him through school, and when he graduated in 1904, he could not afford a commission in a fashionable British regiment. So he joined the Indian Army instead, the 62nd Punjabis. It was considered the less glamorous path, the option for officers who could not buy their way into something better. It turned out to be the making of him, because Auchinleck did something that very few British officers in India ever bothered to do. He learned Punjabi, not a few polite phrases. He became fluent. He studied the local dialects, the customs, the food, the religious practices of his soldiers. He did not treat India as a colonial posting to be endured until something better came along. He treated it as home. His Indian soldiers adored him for it, and that mutual respect would define his entire career. They called him the Auk, and when he spoke, they listened, not because of his rank, but because he had earned it. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Auchinleck deployed with his regiment to defend the Suez Canal. He fought the Ottoman Turks at Ismailia in Egypt, served in the scorching port of Aden, and then moved into Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, where the British Empire was grinding through a brutal campaign against the Ottomans. It was thankless, exhausting fighting in extreme heat with inadequate supplies. Auchinleck thrived in it. By the war's end, he had been promoted and mentioned in dispatches for his exceptional staff work in Kurdistan. After the armistice, he was offered a place at the Staff College at Quetta, recognized as the gateway to advancement in the Indian Army. He was marked as a man to watch. Between the wars, Auchinleck rose steadily through the ranks. He married an American woman named Jessie Stewart after a whirlwind courtship on the French Riviera. He served as an instructor at Quetta and then took command of the Peshawar Brigade on the violent northwest frontier of India in 1933, where he led operations against tribal uprisings alongside Harold Alexander, another future field marshal. By 1938, he was chairing the committee that would modernize the entire Indian Army. The recommendations from that committee transformed the Indian military from a force of 183,000 men in 1939 into a fighting machine of over 2.25 million soldiers by the war's end. That transformation was one of the great logistical achievements of the Second World War, and almost nobody remembers it. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. When World War II broke out, Auchinleck was called back to England. An Indian Army officer commanding a purely British corps was almost unheard of, a sign of just how highly he was regarded. He was given 4 corps. Then, in May of 1940, he was sent to Norway to command 25,000 British, French, and Polish troops in one of the war's most doomed campaigns. The mission was to capture the port of Narvik and deny Germany access to Norwegian fjords for submarine operations. Auchinleck took Narvik on the 28th of May, but the wider campaign was falling apart. France was collapsing on the continent, and every available resource was being pulled back to prepare for the defense of Britain itself. Auchinleck was ordered to withdraw from Norway. The Norway operation was strategically important, but operationally a mess. The forces were inadequate, the logistics were chaotic, and the air cover was practically non-existent. The campaign collapsed, and Auchinleck's forces were evacuated back to Britain. It produced the first serious friction between Auchinleck and Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty. Auchinleck had demanded more supplies, more artillery, and more air cover before committing his forces. Churchill thought he was being timid. Auchinleck thought he was being realistic about what his troops actually needed to succeed. He was right. The under-equipment and mismanagement of the Norway campaign proved that, but being right did not win him any favors with Churchill. That clash of temperaments, the cautious professional versus the impulsive politician, would follow them both for the rest of the war. After Norway, Auchinleck returned to India as Commander-in-Chief. He impressed Churchill briefly in the spring of 1941 by acting aggressively when a pro-Axis regime in Iraq threatened the RAF base at Habaniyah. Auchinleck did not hesitate. He sent a battalion by air and the Indian 10th Infantry Division by sea to crush the threat. Churchill loved decisiveness when it worked. In July 1941, he swapped Auchinleck and Archibald Wavell, sending the Auk to take over as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, the most important theater in the war at that point. And this is where the real pressure began. Churchill wanted an immediate offensive against Rommel in the Western Desert. Auchinleck pushed back. He told Churchill directly that his troops were not properly trained, not adequately equipped, and not ready for a major offensive. Churchill, desperate for a victory to boost morale back home, kept pushing. The exchanges between London and Cairo became increasingly heated. Auchinleck held firm. He finally launched Operation Crusader in November 1941 on his own terms, and it worked. His forces pushed Rommel back across Libya, relieving the besieged garrison at Tobruk after 8 months of brutal isolation and driving the Afrika Korps deep into retreat. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Rommel was not finished. The Desert War had a rhythm to it that outsiders rarely understood. One side would advance, outrun its supply lines, and stall. The other would counterattack, push the first side back, and then outrun its own supply lines in turn. The whole campaign seesawed across Libya and Egypt like a pendulum, and Rommel was the best in the world at exploiting that rhythm. He was weakened after Crusader, desperately short on fuel and ammunition, stretched thin across hundreds of miles of barren desert. But he was studying the British, probing for weaknesses, waiting for them to make a mistake. In January 1942, he struck again. His forces recaptured Benghazi in Libya, and the British were pushed back yet again to the Gazala line, a chain of defensive positions running south from the coast. For months, both sides sat behind their fortifications, rebuilding, resupplying, and preparing for the next round of what was becoming the most exhausting seesaw campaign of the entire war. That next round came in May 1942 at the Battle of Gazala, and what followed was a catastrophe for the British. Rommel launched his assault on the 26th of May, and his armor swept around the southern flank of the British defensive line in exactly the kind of bold, sweeping maneuver that had made him the most feared commander in the theater. The 8th Army, under General Neil Ritchie, was outfought and outmaneuvered at almost every turn. The defensive boxes that were supposed to anchor the Gazala line, brigade-sized strongpoints surrounded by minefields and barbed wire, crumbled in days. Rommel punched through the center, isolated the defenders of Bir Hakeim, where Free French forces held out heroically for 2 weeks and then rolled up the entire British position from behind. On the 20th of June, the fortress port of Tobruk fell. 33,000 Allied soldiers surrendered in a single day. Churchill, who was in Washington meeting with President Roosevelt when the telegram arrived, called it a disgrace. It was the worst British military disaster since the fall of Singapore just 4 months earlier, and it sent shockwaves through the Allied leadership. The 8th Army was now in full retreat, streaming eastward into Egypt. Rommel's panzers chased them across the desert, smelling complete victory. Panic gripped Cairo. At British headquarters, rear echelon units began frantically burning sensitive documents. Embassy officials packed their bags. The Mediterranean fleet evacuated the port of Alexandria. People called it Ash Wednesday. The entire British position in the Middle East, the Suez Canal, the Persian oil fields, the supply route to the Soviet Union through Iran, all of it was on the edge of collapse. Rommel was just 70 miles from Alexandria. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. On the 25th of June, 1942, Auchinleck made 2 decisions that would change the course of the war. First, he fired General Ritchie and took personal command of the 8th Army himself. He flew to the front and told his staff that the danger of complete catastrophe was too great to leave the responsibility with a subordinate. Second, he chose where to make his stand. Not at Mersa Matruh, where most of his officers wanted to fight. He overruled them. Instead, he fell back further, all the way to a tiny desert railway stop called El Alamein. The choice was brilliant. El Alamein sat on the Mediterranean coast, 60 miles west of Alexandria. 40 miles to the south, the Qattara Depression, a vast expanse of impassable salt marshes, quicksand, and steep escarpments, made any flanking movement impossible. For the first time in the entire Desert War, Rommel could not use his favorite tactic. He could not swing his panzers around the British flank. The gap between the sea and the depression was only 40 miles wide. Rommel would have to attack head-on, straight into prepared British defenses. British commanders had identified El Alamein as a potential defensive position back in the 1930s. Auchinleck was the one who finally used it. The Auk signaled his troops with a message that captured everything about the man. He told them he had never been a good loser and that he was going to win. He said the enemy hoped to take Egypt by bluff, and it was time to show him where he gets off. Then he went out into the desert, slept in the sand alongside his soldiers, ate their meager rations, and prepared for the fight of his life. Rommel attacked on the 1st of July. A gigantic dust cloud moving across the Egyptian desert announced the approach of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions bearing down on the British line. They hit the Ruwaysat Ridge, a low, rocky outcrop in the center of the British position, where a scratch force of field artillery, anti-tank guns, and infantry from the 18th Indian Brigade held on with grim determination. They knew they were the last line of defense before Alexandria. Gurkha soldiers from Nepal, who had been in Iraq just weeks earlier and were only at El Alamein because of Auchinleck's foresight in repositioning them, fought at close quarters alongside South African troops in a fortified position nicknamed the Hot Box. The defenders knocked out 18 German tanks during that first brutal afternoon, often firing at point-blank range with obsolete 2-pounder anti-tank guns that were useless at any distance beyond a few hundred yards. The fighting ground on for nearly 4 weeks across the burning Egyptian sand. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees. Water was rationed. Sand got into everything: weapons, food, wounds. Auchinleck did not just sit behind his defenses and absorb punishment. He counterattacked repeatedly, probing Rommel's lines, targeting the weaker Italian units to force the Germans to spread their armor thin. He committed tank forces and the Desert Air Force to the defense of the Ruwaysat Ridge. By mid-July, Rommel finally admitted to himself that he could not conduct any more major offensives with the forces at his disposal. His advance had been stopped cold. He had been thrown onto the defensive. The drive toward the Suez Canal was over. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything that happened afterward. Auchinleck did not just stop Rommel. He broke the momentum of the entire Axis offensive in North Africa. He did it with an army that had been routed at Gazala, demoralized by the fall of Tobruk, and chased across hundreds of miles of desert. He did it by choosing the right ground, deploying the right tactics, and staying at the front where his calm presence steadied his shaken troops. His biographer later wrote that Auchinleck ended the dreary catalogue of reverses and retreats, tactical follies, and ham-fisted generalship. This was the rot he stopped. Even Rommel acknowledged it. In a letter to his wife during the battle, Rommel wrote that Auchinleck was handling his forces with very considerable skill. Coming from the desert fox himself, there was no higher praise. But Auchinleck wanted to wait. He told Churchill that the 8th Army needed time to rest, refit, and receive reinforcements before launching a decisive counteroffensive. Churchill, who was facing votes of no confidence in Parliament and desperately needed an unambiguous victory to shore up his political position, did not want to wait. He flew to Egypt in early August to see the situation in person. On the 8th of August, Churchill sacked Auchinleck and replaced him. Harold Alexander took over as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East. The original choice to command the 8th Army was General William Gott, a popular veteran of the desert fighting. But Gott was killed when his transport plane was shot down by German fighters on its way to Cairo. The job fell instead to Bernard Montgomery, who was flown in from Britain. It was a twist of fate that would reshape how the entire world remembers the war in North Africa. Churchill offered Auchinleck a consolation command, the newly created Persia and Iraq Theatre. Auchinleck refused, believing it was a poorly organized idea designed to cushion the blow of his dismissal. He relinquished command on the 15th of August and quietly disappeared from the sphere of active operations. In many eyes, he left in disgrace. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. Montgomery arrived at El Alamein with every advantage that Auchinleck had created for him. The Axis advance was stopped. The defensive position was established and fortified. The plan for the defense of the Alamein line was in place. And reinforcements were flooding in, including 300 brand new American-built Sherman tanks with 75mm guns that outmatched anything Rommel had. Montgomery walked into a position of strength and then took 2 full months to prepare his offensive, building up a force of 190,000 men against Rommel's 104,000, which was exactly the kind of methodical build-up that Auchinleck had been sacked for wanting to do. Montgomery's first act was to declare that he had burned all plans for retreat and that there would be no withdrawal from El Alamein. It made for a brilliant headline. There was just one problem. Auchinleck had never planned to retreat from El Alamein either. The strong defensive position was his choice. The stand was his decision. There were no retreat plans to burn because Auchinleck had already decided this was where the 8th Army would hold. Montgomery was taking credit for a resolve that was already in place before he ever set foot in the desert. When Montgomery finally attacked in late October 1942 at the Second Battle of El Alamein, he won a decisive victory. It was bloody, grinding, and costly. Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, and British troops fought through dense minefields and brutal close-quarters combat for 12 days before punching through the Axis lines. The Afrika Korps was broken, and Rommel's forces began their long retreat westward across North Africa. It would take another 6 months, but the Axis would eventually be driven out of Africa entirely by May of 1943. El Alamein was genuinely a turning point of the war. Churchill himself said that before El Alamein, the Allies never had a victory, and after it, they never had a defeat. But the version you have heard? That is not the full picture. Montgomery was a master of self-promotion with a genius for managing his public image. He was bold, quotable, and photogenic in his trademark beret. He told the press that before his arrival, there had been no plans, no preparation, and no fighting spirit. He told audiences he alone had transformed the 8th Army from a beaten rabble into a victorious force. He cultivated war correspondence, posed for photographs, gave memorable quotes, and built a personal brand that Auchinleck a modest and private man who would rather eat field rations with his soldiers than talk to a journalist, could never compete with. Over time, the Second Battle of El Alamein became the Battle of El Alamein in popular memory. The first battle, the one Auchinleck fought and won, the one that actually stopped Rommel and made everything afterward possible, simply faded away. As one museum summary put it, El Alamein established the reputation of Montgomery, who used his talent for self-publicity to claim all the credit for the victory. That assessment was not written by Auchinleck's supporters. It was written by a British military museum. If you are finding value in this story, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week. By June of 1943, Auchinleck was quietly reappointed as Commander-in-Chief of India. It was not a glamorous role. It generated no headlines, no newsreel footage, no dramatic quotes for the papers. But the work Auchinleck did in India was critical to the Allied war effort in ways that rarely get discussed. He built the logistical infrastructure, the supply chains, training programs, and maintenance systems that made General William Slim's 14th Army one of the most effective fighting forces of the entire war. The 14th Army was sometimes called the Forgotten Army because it received so little attention from London. It fought some of the most brutal campaigns of World War II in the jungles and mountains of Burma against the Japanese. The critical victories at Imphal and Kohima in 1944, which broke the Japanese advance into India and turned the war in Southeast Asia, were possible because Auchinleck's organization kept Slim's men supplied, trained, and moving forward through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Once again, the Auk did the vital, unglamorous work that made another commander's battlefield triumph possible. And then came the personal devastation. In 1944, while Auchinleck was managing the vast machinery of India's war effort, his wife Jessie left him for Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Pearse, one of Auchinleck's own friends. The divorce was finalized in 1946. Auchinleck never spoke publicly about it. He absorbed the blow in silence, the same way he had absorbed being sacked, with no self-pity and no public complaint. He was promoted to Field Marshal in June of 1946, the highest rank in the British Army. But the honor came wrapped in the most painful assignment of his career. Auchinleck was tasked with overseeing the partition of the Indian Army, dividing the force he had spent his entire adult life building into separate armies for the new nations of India and Pakistan. Around 260,000 men, mainly Hindus and Sikhs, went to India. About 140,000, mainly Muslims, went to Pakistan. Individual units that had served together for generations, regiments where Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim soldiers had fought side by side across North Africa, Italy, and Burma, were torn apart along religious lines. The 19th Lancers in Pakistan exchanged their Jat and Sikh troopers for Muslim soldiers from Skinner's Horse in India. Officers who had led mixed units through years of combat now had to watch their regiments dissolve. The Brigade of Gurkhas, those legendary Nepalese soldiers who had fought at Ruaisat Ridge and across every theatre of the war, was split between India and Britain. Auchinleck hated every moment of it. He believed partition was fundamentally dishonorable, his word, and he refused to accept a peerage, the traditional honor given to retiring senior officers, because he did not want his name associated with a policy he considered a betrayal. He clashed bitterly with Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, over how the process was handled. And from London, Montgomery, still working to sideline the Auk even now, tried twice to have Auchinleck replaced with General Slim. The rivalry followed him to the very end of his service. He left India on the 1st of December 1947. The army he had loved, the country he had called home, the soldiers who had trusted him with their lives, all gone. Auchinleck returned to Britain and lived quietly in a modest flat in Mayfair. He held a few minor administrative positions, nothing that matched what he had been. In 1968, at 84 years old, he moved to Marrakesh, Morocco. He lived there for the final 13 years of his life, cared for by a small circle of local friends and a British corporal named Malcolm Millward. who had been assigned to look after him. A Moroccan woman named Malika also helped care for him, taking him on picnics, having him to her house for Christmas. Small kindnesses from people who knew nothing about El Alamein. Philip Warner titled his biography Auchinleck, The Lonely Soldier. The name fit perfectly. Here was a man who had stopped Rommel when nobody else could, who had modernized the Indian army from a colonial relic into a force of millions, who had built the logistics that made the Burma campaign possible, who had overseen the agonizing partition of a military family he loved, and he died in a rented house in Marrakesh on the 23rd of March, 1981, at 96 years old, while the general who inherited his victory remained one of the most famous military figures of the 20th century. Today, if you visit the Imperial War Museum in London or read any serious academic history of the Desert War, you will find a very different story from the one Montgomery told. Military historians have spent decades correcting the record. Books like Philip Warner's biography, Niall Barr's Pendulum of War, and the work of Corelli Barnett have all restored Auchinleck to his rightful place in the story. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has published articles specifically about how the defenders at Ruwaysat Ridge under Auchinleck's command saved the entire North African campaign. But popular memory moves slowly. Ask most people who won at El Alamein, and they will still say Montgomery. Ask who stopped Rommel, and they will still say Montgomery. Academic truth and public memory are two very different things. The real question is not whether Claude Auchinleck was a great general. Even his harshest critics grant him that. Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote that Auchinleck had most of the qualifications to make him one of the finest of commanders. Rommel considered him among the greatest opponents he ever faced. Churchill himself, despite sacking the man, never denied his ability. The real question is why being right, being brave, and being competent was not enough. Auchinleck was not a man who could play the game. He did not understand the new reality of media warfare that the Second World War had created, a world where the camera and the headline mattered almost as much as the battle itself. He could not charm reporters, craft a personal mythology, or turn tactical decisions into sound bites. He chose his subordinates poorly, a flaw that his critics correctly and repeatedly point out. Alan Brooke himself said that Auchinleck's inability to pick the right men was the greatest single cause of his downfall. He was too loyal to officers like General Ritchie and his Chief of Staff General Corbett, men who were not up to the enormous demands of the Desert War. And when he was replaced, he did not fight back. He wrote no bitter memoirs. He gave no score-settling interviews. He simply walked away and let history be written by someone else. That someone else wrote himself as the hero. Montgomery took the title First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He named himself after the battle that Auchinleck had set up for him. He lived as a celebrated public figure until his death in 1976, 5 years before Auchinleck, and the man who actually saved the day. He spent his last years watching the sun set over the Atlas Mountains in Marrakesh, thousands of miles from the Egyptian desert where he had changed the course of a war. He had no title, no memoir, no score to settle, just a quiet room and the knowledge, shared by historians but not by the general public, of what he had done when it mattered most. Without the Auk, there would have been no El Alamein for Montgomery to win. Without his choice of ground, his defensive plan, his refusal to break under Rommel's assault, the Suez Canal might have fallen, the Persian oil fields might have been lost, and the entire Allied strategy in the Mediterranean would have collapsed. That is the part of the story that almost got lost forever. If this story surprised you, drop a comment and let me know. And if you want more forgotten history like this, subscribe so you do not miss the next one.